All right, people, let's get started. We are a bit late, but I think it's all right. Welcome, everyone, to this first Proof conference. Before we start, I'd like to say a few words about Proof. So we are Proof, Psychedelic Research Organization of Fribourg. We are a student society organizing events, informing the community about psychedelic science in an interdisciplinary fashion. Our other goals are prevention against misuse of psychedelic substances, and the last one is to educate ourselves as members of the society in psychedelic science and psychedelic-related matters in general. And so today, for our first conference, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Ansgar Rougemont-Bücking. So Ansgar is a psychiatrist, private docent, EMDR practitioner, addiction specialist, and researcher in the field of stress-related psychiatric disorders. He works in his office in Vevey as well as in the University of Fribourg, where he leads a research project aimed at measuring neurophysiological reactivity in people suffering from work-related stress. He holds an authorization from the Federal Office of Health to practice therapy assisted by psychedelic substances for the treatment of some of his patients. So he is one of the rare authorized psychedelic therapists here in the country, and we look forward to hear your talk. Thank you, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Adam, for the introduction. Thank you all for inviting me, the Proof Association. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. So I clearly have the impression that you already quite know a bit about the subject, so I will not go too much into detail that you might already know. I decided to add to my title that I want to shed a little bit light on the societal implications of what we do when we work with psychedelics, and what does this mean? What are the questions that arise? And this is the things I'm interested. As Adam said, I'm a clinician, also having some experience in science, in research, and I try to build bridges between the application and also the background, the scientific background. I think this is very challenging to implement the psychedelic experience into the standard paradigms. And this is something I want to develop with you tonight a little bit. So you certainly know some of these books here. We have to be aware that we are in a tradition of several decades of work with these substances or with this state of mind, altered states of consciousness. And one of the of course, contribution in Switzerland was Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD by taking it himself. So he's really experienced by himself. I think it's very important to emphasize that. And then, of course, you have people like Stanislav Grof, who made his whole career with working and exploring altered states of consciousness. And with or without substances, as you know, there's also the holotropic breathwork approach that is very interesting and important to mention. And this was the last century, and then in the new century came up. There was, as you know, very little activity in the field. And down there came the last 10 years a psychedelic renaissance. One of the books that was introducing that is from Henrik Jungerberg and other authors. It was written in German. It was quite positing the basis of knowledge at that time. And since that, there have been lots of other publications, and many people, especially the broader public, they know the book of Michael Pollan, which is very appealing to read, and it seems to, everything is possible and open, and everything is nice, and there's hope for transformation. And in the French-speaking world, this is the books of Olivier Chambon, who published several other books, but this was for a long time the only book you could find in the French libraries about the psychedelic medicine. And now there are lots of other publications. A book from Pollan was translated as well. So we stand in this tradition, and in Switzerland the situation is particular because we have this association, the SET, Swiss Doctors Association for Psychological Therapy, which had a long approach of informing and trying to build up research projects, to build up relationship with the authorities in order to develop these therapies. And we are very lucky and very grateful that the SEPT, especially the President Peter Gasser, did that work for many, many years. He was one of the first who studied the LSD effects in therapy in a study about 10 years ago. And this is going on, and we stand in this tradition. And the SEPT also brought up this possibility in collaboration with the authorities to do compassionate use, using these therapies for treating just patients, yeah, and giving exceptional authorizations. And I'm very grateful that I can use these substances, and I'm a member of the SEPT, and I can practice and gain experience with that. And I'm very grateful for that. So the main substances I'm working with, you probably all know. This is LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and also what I really have to emphasize a lot is ketamine. We have a major focus on the classical psychedelic substances, serotoninergic, but there are also alternatives. And I think that ketamine is very important to mention because you don't have to have an authorization from the authorities. Every physician can prescribe it in Switzerland. It's cheap, and it's not too deep, it's not too challenging, and it's not too long. So you can use it, and I use it regularly with all of my patients. I do first 1 or 2 ketamine sessions before even considering doing something else. So I think ketamine is a very important tool to start using these approaches, because it's not too deep, it's not too long, it's not too costly. You don't need to spend a whole day with it. And it's very important for me also to say ketamine is a legal means of practicing this in training for therapists. This is legal, we can do this. And I was building up in Lausanne training for therapists and for doctors using ketamine in a legal framework. I hope that we will be soon allowed to use also other substances in training psychotherapists, because for me the self-experience of the therapist is crucial. It's a crucial prerequisite to ask for, in my opinion. So this is just something you certainly know. This is what is this all about? It's about enlarging our field of consciousness. And this is, you certainly have known these studies about the default mode network. That is where we are normally when we think. We think here and there, and normally we just think about ourselves. And this at the long term is quite heavy. And there was a study from Killingsworth about how happy or how heavy is it to just think about certain things, or try not to think about anything. And he found out that if we do mind wandering, we just spend our time not thinking about ourselves, our lives, our narratives, our ego in a certain way. He said then, this is here, we are quite unhappy. The more we walk in our labyrinth of the self, of the ego, the more we are happy, not so happy. And when we achieve to go into a state where we're not so much wandering in ourselves, we are not mind wandering, then we are rather feeling better. And this is what I really like. The ability to think about what is not happening is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. And this is something really, this is about altered state of consciousness. We go out of the box, and we accompany our patients to go out, to dare to go out of the box and have a different understanding and perception of ourselves. And it's not so much in the head with the thinking all the time, the thinking cap we have, it's also related to the bodily experience. And I think this is just important to remind that it's really about going out of the self-narrative that is giving us identity, but it's also creating suffering. So you have these studies, and this is one example, the study from Felix Müller in Basel, where he shows that if you put the people in the psychedelic state, you have all of a sudden a kind of explosion of connection that is coming up between different centers of the brain. And In the methodology, you put a region of interest, a seed, and then you calculate the correlations that change according to having taken a substance or not. And this is a kind of a research approach that is very frequently used for this kind of research. And I think it's always what I explain to people. It's often here, this area here, the thalamus, which is kind of on the top of a spine, which is kind of a cap that is filtering the information that goes to the other parts of the brain. And we have the idea that the thalamus is kind of shut down, and more information is coming from everywhere, from the body, from the brainstem, and it's the transfer of this information to different areas that it's normally not possible or not used, can be done much more easily. And this is one of the major effects of psychedelics. This is what we call the disruption of the default mode network. This is one of the explanations. I think it's a good example of getting an idea what is happening during that altered state of consciousness state. But then what we could observe in the last 5 years is really a big surge in interest from the medias, from science in these approaches, lots of publications. And I would say there is a high expectancy bias from the population, from people, also from the therapists, because we have the impression this can really open up new venues of therapy, of transformation, and the hope, of course, of the people of the population is set up quite high. And of course, we try to correspond to this expectancy bias. So I think this is what I hear very often from patients that come to see me. They say, I heard one session gives me more than 10 years of therapy, or I can finally find my true self, who I am, and this goes very quickly. I'm not afraid of anything anymore because I kind of died. That's what I heard. And I hear all the time, I want to come to see you and get as quickly as possible my LSD session. This is very frequent, I get this. So this is enormous expectancy in the population. And of course, this puts the therapist under pressure because you want to correspond in a certain way to this expectation. And there's also what I say a publication bias, because it's at the moment, it's very easy to publish something if you have the word psychedelic in the title and the abstract. This is very easy. It's much more difficult to publish in different and other domains. And so I see lots of papers that are not so good quality, but I just see it's just about psychedelics, and at the moment you can publish anything. And this is, in general, what the book of Poland brought up is a total media hype. You can, there's every week in the newspaper somewhere in Europe or in the United States an article about psychedelics. And of course, this brings all this surge and excitement also. And I think it's very important that we are aware what this is making with us as scientists and also therapists, this expectancy and this hype. So this is my reality. So I get every week several of these kind of emails where people just ask me, they tell me their story a little bit, and they tell me there's something going on and they cannot get it. There's something, they tried so many therapies, so many complementary therapies. They took all the medications, and there's still something that is eating them up somewhere. And what I find very interesting is that this is much more increased, this phenomenon of awareness of something's getting up since the COVID crisis. I think the COVID crisis is a collective crisis that showed us that there's something not so right with our way of living, because we were able to change it from one day to the other. And there's something not right about the way we interact with each other and we do business and all that stuff. And I think this brings awareness that people come to question their self-narrative. Is the story I'm telling myself about myself, is it the real story? Or maybe there's something different. So the people are starting, and this is what I see a lot in my practice, to doubt. And the doubt brings them into therapy, and then they want to get answers to their question. And this is not so easy to get. So this is, we certainly know, these are the 3S rule: substance, set, and setting. Of course, the substance is important in order to get an idea of how long the process will be, how deep it is. Is this more on the body or more on the brain? Is the heart open? Is the amygdala shut down or not? So these are important decisions to take about this, choosing the substance. And as I said, I would always start with easy substances like ketamine or MDMA, and then have some experience and testing the relationship with the patient before getting to more challenging substances. And then, of course, what the patient brings in, this is the set. You have to be prepared to unveiling of a volcano that can be very deep and very, very surprising. And you have to give a vessel to this in order to hold. And this is the responsibility of the therapist to create a setting in which this emergency can get up. Things emerge. And this is the responsibility of the therapist to prepare a setting, as you see, with a nice room, with music, with the patient, of course, laying down and trying to go into contact with things that are normally not evident. And this brings me to the things that are hidden and now coming up. And I'm much interested in substance abuse. That's where I learned most from addicted patients. And I came to the conclusion that all the addicted patients I've seen, they have been traumatized somewhere. And the trauma sometimes and typically is not evident. It's sometimes hidden. And this brings up to the phenomenon of traumatic dissociation. And traumatic dissociation is just characterized that there's something hidden and we try to push it back and we put sand and beton concrete on it because it's so heavy and so horrible, but it will come up. And this is the therapeutical work that we have to do, and these are the people in the blue overalls, that these are the therapists and the patients, and we both have to dig in the shit and have a look at it, and this is therapy. And this is very, very demanding for the patient and also for the therapist. And the therapist also can get traumatized by that work. I know that an EMDR therapist or trauma therapist, they have really hard, challenging situations, and they have to be careful not to be traumatized secondary from the work they do, because this is heavy what these people do. This is the author I like really a lot, Judith Herman. She's writing about the dialectic between avoidance and intrusion, and this can be observed not only on the individual level but also on the societal level. This book, Trauma and Recovery, was not translated into French. This is for me very revealing that this book was translated in so many languages but not in French. And in French psychotherapeutical culture there's quite a lack of this knowledge how it was described in that book. And this is certainly things you have already heard, and in other epidemiological studies about trauma, these are typical numbers we have in the big surveys from the United States that show, and this is the important thing, these things occur during the young age already. The evidence of trauma is not something that is primarily adults have to deal with, but the big problem is children and teenagers have to deal with it. And it's really high. You have any traumatic experience, and these are not little worries. These are big things that just happen, are to about 40% of the population before the age of 13. And sexual violence, it's about 10% before the age of 13. And then, of course, 13, 14, 15, 16 youngsters, they still have to face to other incidents of traumatic experience. And I show the first picture up there is this. It seems to be it's a natural disaster catastrophe with victims, and the lower one is interpersonal violence. Both can lead to traumatization, but I think the most important ingredient to make out of a potentially traumatic situation a post-traumatic disorder is the reaction of the social compound. If the people are taken care of, if someone is taking care of these, the relatives of these people that have lost people, the injured one, the homeless one, or if someone takes action to protect that boy, the boy will not develop a post-traumatic stress disorder if someone is caring adequately. But the problem is in our society we have a culture of neglect and we do not care properly. We let people alone, especially children, but also adults. And this is what makes a trauma becoming a post-traumatic stress disorder, because there was no appropriate reaction from the side of the people responsible to interact. I think this is, for me, very important to stress, because I see in my treatment that the patients are shocked more by the absence of care and protections than by the aggression many times. So it's important there is always a social compound when there's a trauma within the social network. And this is true also for natural disasters, when people are let alone after catastrophe. And maybe you have heard from the studies of Noemi Eisenberger. She examined what is happening in the brain of a person when she is rejected, or if she is in grief, or she is reminded of a very difficult breakup of an emotional relationship, reject, loss of relationship, all these difficult human experience in the relationship. How does this is perceived in the brain? And what she was able to show, that the same brain areas are activated like in physical pain. So it's important that there's the equivalence of social and psychological painful situations and having a broken arm or leg. This hurts in the same area in the brain. You see here the insula, the AEs in the insular cortex, and the DACC is a part of the cingulate cortex in the frontal lobe. And these are typical areas that are related to coding pain. And the pain is regardless of it's a broken arm or it's a broken relationship. So we have an alarm system in our body that is not only coding for loss of a vital organ, but it's also coding for loss of a vital relationship. And we are human. We are social animals. So if we lose connection, this is very painful, and this is coded as being very dangerous. And this is, in my opinion, what happens in psychiatry. Our patients are people that have lost connection. And this is another study that is very important to cite. It's the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this is in addition to what I showed before. The other was single difficult or incidents, like an accident, someone died, or maybe there was an assault. But this study, they focused on repeating stress. And also, as you see, before the age of 18 in this case, the ACE study, before the age of 18, what happened to these people as repetitive stress during growing up. And there are 10 different criteria: neglect, mistreatment, and household dysfunction. And this is all situations that are not, as I said, not just once. This just happened again and again. Like when one parent was alcoholic, one parent was had a psychiatric disorder, there was repeated neglect, this kind of stuff. And if you get to these numbers, and it's quite shocking, then you see only 32.7% of the population have the chance to reach the age of 18 without having to face any of these stress factors. Only 1/3 of normal people in the United States that are rather belonging to the higher class, because they were all in health insurance, these people. So they're rather in the higher economical class, and only 1/3 arrived at the age of 18 without any major repetitive stress, which does not mean that they might not have another stress that was revealed in the other study. No? It's complementary. So there's a very high prevalence of traumatic stress in the population, in the general population. And what is most shocking, if you can also sum up these scores, that's 0, 1, 2, 3 of these factors up to 10. And we see, this is the other number here, that 10.5 of the general population had to face 5 or more stress factors during childhood and adolescence. That's enormous, 10%. And then if you do the correlations between these stress factors and other medical problems or social problems later in life, and this is a follow-up branch of that study. They followed the people. How were they evolving with all that stress? And there's a clear positive correlation between the more you have dealt with stress, the more you are vulnerable later in life to have all kinds of problems in psychiatry, with addictions, but also with somatic disease, autoimmune diseases, hypertension, cancer. All this is related to stress exposure during childhood and youth. And you do this with drug abuse, and it's really highly significant. No? And this is confirming my hypothesis that all drug addicts they have been traumatized. And sometimes they cannot even remember it because it's hidden in dissociation. And I'll come to this a little bit later. So I like a lot this conclusion of this book from Rougemont-Bücking. This is an excellent book. It's resuming all the evidence for the effects of trauma in the society and on the individual. And I really like the subtitle, which is the hidden epidemic. Because it's so obvious that it's so important, and we do not talk about it. We pretend that trauma is rare. And we pretend that psychiatric disorders are metabolic disorders of the serotonin system in the brain. This is the current explanation I heard so many times in my training, yes. This is our explanation. And this is regardless of the evidence that was brought up by science. And this is an old problem that's not new. If you see the debate between Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud, what is dissociation? What is trauma? What are post-traumatic disorders? And Janet was putting in front his interpretation of scientific evidence, because they all studied the subjects in the Salpêtrière, and he came to the conclusion dissociation is lack of integration. And Freud, who studied the same subjects, came to the conclusion that dissociation is a form of psychological resistance. What does that mean? We will talk a lot about, I will explain a little more about the idea of dissociation as a lack of integration. And the dissociation idea of being a psychological resistance is just an explanation of that the victim or a person has rather a fantasy that is of sexual or aggressive content, and the problem is arising how to deal with this fantasy and how to resist against this fantasy. But the question of the trauma occurred, yes or no, has no importance. So this is a difference that January said that the lack of integration is just the fact that the organism cannot deal with that occurrence, and it cannot deal with it, so it has to put it somewhere in the drawer of dissociation, and then it has a hidden life. And Freud rather said, no, this is the rejection of the subject that does not face to have aggressive or sexual fantasies about the parents. But this is, with the regard from a traumatologist, this is just absurd to claim that the problematic of a patient comes from aggressive or sexual impulses against the parents. As we know, the parents are abusing and beating the children and not the other way. So it's very important to realize, for me, this is very important what I'm saying, because there was a scientific evidence. Freud and Janet, they examined these women. And they both came to conclusion there's something about trauma. And hysteria has to do something with trauma. And they come to different interpretations of evidence. And I think we should be aware of this, that we have scientific evidence here now as well. And what is the interpretation we're doing as scientists? What are we telling ourselves and society about what we have found out? And I think it's very important to remind what happened between Janet and Freud. And they were both students of Charcot. And they were both very ambitious physicians at that time, especially Freud, because this was the major public health problem of the 19th century, hysteria. And we are also today facing, as scientists and therapists, the major public health problem of our time, which might be depression or burnout or drug addiction. And we also are struggling to find explanation that we might explain to the public. And we may also explain this to the people that give us money to do research. And I think we have to be aware of the biases that we carry as therapists and also as scientists to give an explanation to the public about the evidence that we perceive of trauma within the population. So I think we can learn a lot from that debate about hysteria and about many other traumatic disorders like shell shock, the soldiers of First World War I. There was a whole debate, what is this about? And I think we are really in a difficult position as scientists to bring up conclusions, explanation to the public that is socially acceptable. And the Freud hypothesis of the Oedipus complex, where the child has sexual urges and aggressive urges against the parents, and this is the core of the problem, is still very much presented in the public and also in many therapists and also in the scientific world. Although we know today that this is wrong. The child did not rape the parent raped the child. This is a fact. This is what we hear from the patients. So we have to be aware that there are huge interactions between society that only can accept certain explanations. If Freud had said, which he did first, at the bottom of hysteria is a sexual trauma. That was his first publication, 1896, so Étiologie de Hystérie. And when he published that, there was total not acceptance at all from the peers of this kind of claims. So he modified it and he developed then later the Oedipus hypothesis of that, what happened to that woman. So it's, for me, why I say that it's very important that we are aware how we deal as scientists and therapists with the evidence of trauma and what kind of interpretations we present to the public. And I think the psychedelics bring this to the very upfront, that we have to deal with the occurrence and the evidence of trauma, because this is coming up in therapy so much. So this is the model of normal integration. In orange, you see this is the working memory, central executive. That's how you think about what's happening right now. Thinking, and you put your attention to the future or to the past. You're able, especially, these are the green arrows, you go to the past and you look for specific information. This happened to me, this person I know, this is this and that, this means this and this. So you can deal with the present situation and you can anticipate the future. But you can walk around your consciousness quite freely. This is the ideal of normal integration. If you have a traumatized person, we get something quite different. We see that the energy, the amount of thinking that is available for thinking, the present, the working memory, it's much reduced because it has to deal with something coming from the past. It's kind of an intrusion. It lays heavily down on the working memory, and the problem is people cannot actively go into that. They cannot look for specific information. Whenever they try, that's the green arrows, it's blocked. They cannot go on. This is so typical. If you ask people for difficult experience in the childhood, often they will say, "I don't remember anything." This is traumatic dissociative amnesia. This is the rule. This is not the exception. This is normal. People cannot remember because I remember Yanni. Trauma is defined as overpassing the integrative capacities. And as long as it's overpassed, people cannot remember. But the symptoms are still there on the bodily level. And the symptoms, they manifest with the flashes as intrusions. The intrusions can be a sudden pain, a panic attack, or it can be automated thinking, I'm bad, I'm ugly, I'm guilty. These are automated intrusion that comes from the trauma, from the abuse. And this is totally uncontrollable by the subject, and the subject really has to spend lots of time and energy just to contain. And also the person might use substance like alcohol to calm this down, because it's very heavy to carry. And these people have very little energy to anticipate the future. They're really stuck, and they have to carry this trauma. And traumatologists, they call this part that is from the past that is not accessible, but it's intruding. They call this the emotional part, la partie émotionnelle. And the other part that is dealing with the daily life, that is going to the doctor, that having a coffee with friends, working. This is the A and P, this apparently normal part. And we think, in our classical psychiatric paradigm, we think A and P that is well adapted to society and is making money and paying the bills is a good person. That's what we claim. And therapy is supposed to bring people to have a well-functioning A and P, to adapt well to society. So the problem is that A and P is considered to be healthy in this regard. But if we have a look at traumatic dissociation, we realize that A and P is not healthy. It's only apparently normal. It's just surviving, helping the whole system to survive. And it's also fueling the antagonism and to strike back the EP, the emotional part that always popping up, like a ghost. We have this idea of ghosts that are hidden in the basement, and they come up, and A and P always try to hold that back. And this is how the many people, traumatized people, work in daily life. And the problem with classical psychiatric paradigms, I see many times that we are just dealing with A and P and trying to build up A and P, and we call these are the resources of the person, but we are not aware. The more we do that, the more we sustain also traumatic dissociations, because the other part, the EP, is excluded from the therapy. And this is a very problematic setup. So these are the works from this Dutch specialists, also American specialists, I really appreciate a lot. The livre en français, Le Soi hanté, The Haunted Mind, The Haunted Soul, I think in English. Very interesting. And it's really, for me, it's crucial for a psychedelic therapist to have a good knowledge about this. But because this pops up in therapy regularly, that all of a sudden the EP is coming up, and the EP is defined, it's stuck in the past. The EP has not yet realized that the threat and the trauma is over. This is typical. And when you give psychedelics to these people, all of a sudden there's a little child talking to you, is in anger, is traumatized, is full of fear, and this is just happening. And you have to be able to read that and to interact with that. And especially This is very challenging if the people, the children, and have to adapt to repeated mistreatment, because this brings the person to identify with the aggressor, with the perpetrator, in order to survive. This is a typical situation of captivity, where there's no escape possible and you have to adapt with the perpetrator. Like in the case of Natasha Kampusch, then she was secluded and she was dig down deep in the basement, and whenever the perpetrator, Wolfgang Priklopil, whenever he left to go to work or to go shopping, she was afraid and she was praying for him to come back, because her life depended on that man. So this is explaining why a victim of chronic mistreatment develops a very strong bond with the perpetrator and identifies also with some of the values and the way of interacting in order to survive. Because if the victim goes into opposition, the victim will not survive. So the victim has to submit and identify with it in order to survive. And this is something you can observe in the individual, but you can also observe this in societies. A mistreated society, you will observe that people are identifying with the logic of power, because their survival depends on that. And we call this Stockholm syndrome. And this is very, very frequent. It's not rare. And in my opinion, that's why I do research on burnout. This is also totally what's happening in the workplace, because people have to work to pay their bills. And they adapt and accept things that are against their values often. This is moral injury. And they continue and continue until they just cannot go anymore. This is, for me, adaptation to trauma, chronic mistreatment, burnout. That's what I try to investigate in my research. So captivity brings up to traumatic attachment, identification of the perpetrator, and this is the most difficult part to treat. So these are the important alterations that you can find in traumatized persons. I don't go to the hard words so much, all the things you know, the modification of the immune response, the stress response of the body. I go mainly to the three big challenges for therapists is the phobic avoidance of the traumatic memory. It's the thing what I explained, this wall from the EP, you cannot go through this because it's too painful. This is what brings up clinically as phobic avoidance of the traumatic memory. The second is the deficit of contextualization. I will explain it to you. And the last, the most difficult one, it's traumatic attachment in the relationship. And this is something you cannot treat with substances. You only can work on this in the relationship. So this is, in my view, these are the clinical problems of complex PTSD patients. Phobic avoidance of traumatic memory. This is, I will show you, when the amygdala rises up, and as soon as you go into the difficult memory, the traumatic memory. And this you can overcome very good with MDMA. So I think MDMA is a very precious substance in order to go in direction of the trauma, the traumatic memory. The other problem is the deficit of contextualization. That means the EP, the traumatic part, it still is convinced to be in the situation of mistreatment, of threat, now. So the context of now in which the ANP is living has not yet reached the consciousness of the EP. The EP is stuck in the past, in the context of the past. So this is a deficit of contextualization which can be overcome, in my opinion, very well with classical psychedelics. Because what is the psychedelic experience? It's just a confrontation with the context of here and now. And the last, the traumatic attachment, this is, in my opinion, this is just the whole that you have to be present in the relationship in order to bring the person out of this traumatic attachment to abuse. You have to show the patient ways to get out of this identification. This is only possible when you are present as a human being and showing there are other ways of interacting. This is very challenging. And on the neuroscientific biological level, there are phenomena like fear extinction learning that I find very interesting to study. Also in the animal model, in my opinion, that is. And of course, what is very interesting, trauma therapy, all this idea of memory reconsolidation. You activate the memory, you go with it, and then you can modify it. And this is also what's happening in the psychedelic sessions. But the most important tool in all that is this therapeutical integrity of the therapist. It's never the substance that is doing that alone. You have to be present, and you have to accompany this shaping, new shaping of synaptic plasticity in the relationship. That's so important. It's not the substance doing that. It's opening the gate, but you have to work then with it. This is the neurobiology of what we can call the phobic avoidance of traumatic memory. This is a very clear study where people go into contact, they try to remember something very heavy in their past, in their lives, and you see when they do that, the amygdala and the hippocampus, they're lighting up. That's this alarm signal. This is very painful. Don't go there. And this is the reason why they can't go. Normally, it's not possible to go to these memories. This is the proof of traumatic amnesia. You can't go it. Don't go because the amygdala says stop. This is the way it is in all people, everybody. And in traumatized people, it's so heavy that they just cannot go. And if you give MDMA to these people, that's the blue, this soothing down, it's calm. And you can have a calm and distant look on what happened. And this is what you see with MDMA. They can look at the trauma and say, yeah, okay, it happened, I see it now. And yeah, I realize it's over. I realize it happened, and I realize it's over. I'm now safe now. And this brings up the idea of it's over is what I call the deficit of contextualization. There are many studies going this. The ability to identify correctly the context of now. And if you go in the context of now, you can, a patient can realize that he or she is safe now, and this is the healing information. But you can also go in the context of now and realize that all the stories you're telling yourself from morning to evening, there's a problem. Something is not right in the narrative. And the context of now brings us in feeling, okay, there's a pain somewhere. There's a burden somewhere. So the context can bring reassurance, but the context can also bring up difficult things that also are hidden in your body. And that's why I think the psychedelic experience can be blissful, but it also can be traumatic because it brings up the trauma, the context. That's why we can never be sure in which direction the psychedelic experience will go, because it brings up the context of here and now. So the areas that were identified, and I was lucky to do a study about this when I was in America, is the DACC, that is this yellow spot that is too activated, too much activated, overactivated all the time. And there's another region which is called the VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the blue one, which is not active enough. It's shut down. And this is acquired. You're not born like this, you become like this because of trauma. And this is one of the underlying mechanisms of PTSD. And this, on the phenomenological level, translates into the feeling, I'm never safe. This is what you can see in brain scans. And this is what the patient will tell you. Basically, I never feel safe. And this means that there's an EP somewhere and threatening the whole equilibrium. And the EP is coming from a trauma that is not contextualized yet. And then what is very interesting, you go to studies all about drug addiction, and you find the same zones. The same areas in the brain, the DACC here, red, and the VMPFC in green, this regulation is active in addicts, drug addicts. The same problem. And we know now that these areas are regulating the lower centers like the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala, and they push or they calm down. So they're regulating fear and pleasure. All this is regulated by the higher cortical zones. And this is deeply dysregulated in drug addiction and in trauma. And this explains why in these people you have so many dysregulations in all aspects of daily life. Pleasure, social interactions, everything is related to this kind of coding. And these are regions of interest for neuroscientific research. And this is interesting because if you see some of these studies, you see that the scientists, they put the region of interest exactly in the zone. So you see the VMPFC, here's the red point. And you see that under effect of psilocybin, this connectivity totally changes. And above here you see the also default mode network activated, and then if you give psilocybin, it's shut down. It's completely different. It's interesting to see these areas are core areas for understanding PTSD, and they are modified crucially with psilocybin or with the other substances. So I'm always interested in these regions. You can scroll through different publications and you can get an idea what are the regions of interest, but they are very highly important for understanding PTSD and drug addiction. And also the DACC, if you see it here in this study from 2017, it's modified with the effects of ayahuasca. So we know that these substances, they do something with the centers that are so crucial for maintaining symptoms of PTSD. So this is for me the continuum of holistic state on the left and dissociative state on the right. This is a continuum. There are different layers and situations of dissociation. This is the black line. You see the EP, and the phenomenology of the EP is, as I said, the trauma is not over yet. And the ENP, the phenomenology of the ANP says, all I can do, all I'm doing, I'm surviving. That's what I do. I'm surviving. This is what you hear so many times from your patients. I realize that I'm not living, I realize I'm just surviving. And that because the EP is there, and the EP pushes up through the wall. And on the very right range you find multiple personality disorder, which many scientists claim does not exist, but I would say it does exist from my observations. And on the left side you find the normal state, ego state, where people can say, okay, now I feel like a little child, but I can go in, I can go out, I'm aware, I'm not compelled to act like a little child, I can act like an adult. So people can walk in and out in a holistic integration. And this is then something that can happen in the psychedelic experience. You don't know where exactly the person is, you don't know how much EP this person has, but you put psychedelics on it and then it can go toward the right side or the left side. And if it goes to the right side, in my opinion, it goes into a beta trip. It can be very challenging because all the EP pops up and it's overwhelming, because trauma is defined as overpassing the integrative capacities. And if you have a traumatic experience during a trip, that means the information is too much to be integrated at that time. And you as a therapist, your role is to try to frame it and to make it absorbable. This is the bad trip. In my opinion, a bad trip brings lots of important information. It's not a side effect, it's crucial that we work with it. And often we are also lucky and we go to the left side, to the good trip, oceanic, blissful state. And then we are happy because the context of now is telling the person you are in peace, you're not under threat anymore, you can live your life here now and you can get out of the survival mode. So both is possible and both is crucial to understand for the patient. The contextualization of getting awareness of the trauma within the EP system that is still there, and also the awareness of getting out of the whole thing. So this is what you learn when you do trauma therapy treatment training, that you have to check for dissociation. It's a very crucial checkup. In which way do you have to develop an understanding of the dissociation? What is the functional equilibrium in which the person is stuck in order to survive? And how can you talk to these parts and bring them up and transform them? So you have to really get an awareness of separateness. Is that something that is being apart, or is the patient able to go everywhere? And often it takes a long time to go there. So therapy is kind of going into co-consciousness. There's my consciousness of now, but I realize that's something else, and it's important that I have a look at this, and I can dare to go there. And only if the person has realized what happened and what is going on, then you can heal the person. But this, for me, is all phenomenology. This is something that you cannot really frame in classical empirical science, in my opinion. You really have to get an understanding of sense of the person. How does it feel? How is it? This is phenomenology. And just to remind, of course, if you go on the very much on the left side in the psychedelic experience, you go out of Platon's cave. You go into something that you cannot put in words. We have to be aware of that, and this is something that is part of the experience. So I just have some more slides now for some more implications of the work we do with these states. I would like to remind the paradigm of learned helplessness, which you can find in all kinds of models, animal models, human models. It's just you forced to learn to an animal to get traumatized, whatever it does. So the dog normally can jump out of the cage and get protected from being shocked. And learned helplessness, he's shocked whatever the dog does, regardless. So he learns it doesn't matter to move or to act. I just will be shocked and be punished, whatever. So I stay. So this learned helplessness, and I think many patients, this is a model also for depression, many patients are in this dynamic. I don't believe that I can have any impact on my life anymore. And this is very deeply acquired and rooted, so the dog will stay. It will not jump out anymore, and the human being that is in such functioning will not believe that it can do anything. He can do anything about itself. What do you need to do with such a dog? You cannot explain him he should jump. You just have to take him out and show him that in the other room there's no shock. This is what the therapist must do. You cannot just explain that, just jump, because he tried so many times already, and why should he believe you? You have to show him, okay, I show you, I bring you there, and then the dog sees, okay, yeah, here, I'm not shocked anymore. But this is really a classical model of therapy that there must be some entity that is helping that person. And this is, in my opinion, what we should do as human beings. We should help each other. And we all can be in a situation where we don't know how to move on anymore, and then we need to have someone who helps us. And then we have to get our resources, and then we can walk again. Then we can jump again and make new experiences. And this is for me that I would say this kind of therapy is also an act of spiritual exchange, because it's allowing a person to go into a healing relationship. And you must be, as a therapist, ready to play that role and be able to do that. And in my opinion, what of course is the most potent healing ingredient in life is love. But what is love? So there's so many different concepts. I think that in the spiritual understanding, love is the combination of compassion, acceptance, and trust. And if you're able to show that to a patient, this is a way of love that you can spend as a human being. And this is also an attitude that you should try to develop to yourself as a therapist and a human being. But this is for me clearly a spiritual dimension that arises when we do this kind of work. And this is for me very important that this is for me the crucial element of the therapy, because it opens up a field, and then you show the patient that it's possible to walk on its own, and then you encourage the patient to do by its own. And this is what we call activating of the inner healer. Because I think every being has the capacity to go towards healing, but we just have to show them the first steps. That's what this man does with the dog. We have to show the first step. We have to bring some water to that man. He has to drink, and then he can walk alone again. So I really much emphasize that, because this kind of discourse has no place in current scientific descriptions of the psychedelic experience, and I think this is just a scandal. Because, because what is psychedelics? What does it mean? It reveals the soul. And if we pretend in science now that we don't even have to talk about this, it's just a total denial. Because psychedelics is revealing the soul. That's what we say. So if we do psychedelic science and we do not talk about the soul, then there's something wrong with the whole discourse. Okay, and this is just to the end, the metaphors I often am confronted. This is the idea of contextualization. This is something I get very often from my patients. They say, I kind of feel like the ugly duckling, and I want to become this. I want to get connection with my beautiful self. Please do this kind of therapy with me. These are about the requests I get, that people want to get healed and become and realize that they're a beautiful being. And this is something that is much more what I really see, that this is a story of Parzival. Some of you know already, I told this a couple of weeks ago. I think it's important to remind that this is a boy that was born from a warrior who was a very famous warrior, the father of Parzival. And he died in combat. And he left his little boy with his mother, and the mother was a queen. And she said, I will never allow my boy, my son, to become a warrior and die in combat like my father, like his father and her partner. She lost. So she went, in order to protect the child, she went in a deep forest, in seclusion, isolation, in order that he becomes not attracted to worship and chivalry. And that's how he grew up. And all of a sudden, the boy realized that there's a world beyond the forest, because there were people getting in and out and telling stories, and he wanted to get out in the world and become some person as well. So the mother tried to retain him, to keep him, but she wasn't able to retain him. He wanted to go out in the world. And what did she do? She prepared a special dress for him, in order to this dress will show the world that you are a king's son. And you will be welcomed like a king's son on all the courts of Europe. So she made for him this kind of dress. And this is with this identity the boy went into the world. Because he was told that by his mother. If I have this dress, everybody will know who I am, and I will be loved and will be successful with this dress. And then he realized that it's not happened at all. He got into lots of trouble, this boy. He got rejected and he got in lots of fights, but he was clever and strong, so he survived with his identity. And then he modified more and more his identity. He identified with a new system of becoming a warrior and become a very successful warrior. And then he was allowed to come to King Arthur's table round and become educated as a king's son. And he learned all the practices of royalty, and the most important virtue was contenance, not showing emotions, staying distant. That was the highest virtue of the king's table. And with this identity, he thought, I have learned everything. I'm on the top of my development. I'm strong, victorious, and I have the best education ever. That's how he went into the world. And then something happened, and he went on the castle. He was invited to dinner with the person from the castle, and the person, the king of the castle, he had a wound in the body. And he sat next to that man, and he didn't ask any question. He just noticed it, but he just didn't ask any question. And then he kind of failed this mission, because then he was chased away from this castle, and he was put a curse on him that he would not see the light for 7 years. And so he kind of learned that with all the identity he had developed, he was failing the most important mission, apparently. And then he was kind of, he had to crash down. He was getting a deep depression and sick, and he went to this eremite and seclusion, and he made a spiritual transformation. He got awareness about who I am as a human being. And it took 7 years of suffering, of feeling lots of doubts about who he is. And then finally, he went back, and then he was something who knew himself. And then he went back to this castle with this wounded man, and he asked him, what happened to you? How are you doing now? And how can I help you? And then he became the king of the Grail. And this is, in my opinion, what we should try to do. Getting knowledge about ourselves and show compassion for the people around us. Okay, and now I would like to end with some slides about the theory of science. I think it's just to know what we do in science is we try to increase understanding. What is knowledge? What is understanding? How we deal with certainty and how we deal with doubt. And how we put things together in order to get a view on something. This is epistemology. And there are many approaches, and I would like to mention 2 approaches. This empirical science and this phenomenology. Empirical science, that we do methods, we develop methods, and we have hypotheses and theses, and we try to prove or reject hypothesis. This is an empirical paradigm. That's the predominant paradigm in science in the last 500 years. And there's also something that is a little bit different, that is phenomenology. This is why we go to understand the deeper essence of a thing. And we put all different aspects, but it's also our understanding, our feeling, our intuition. What is a thing, what we are observing. And this is what we call the Wesensschau, to perceive the Gestalt, the essence. And this is phenomenology. And this is, in my opinion, what we do when we work with psychedelics in experience. We get a sense of a deeper Gestalt of the thing of our interest. And this is, in my opinion, then, we have several kinds of evidence, and all this is true. I'm not saying there's something wrong. It's that this is true and this is true, and we just have to put the things together in an understanding in which we are including ourselves as well. And then we get to the true core of the thing of an interest. And this is just like the basic idea of phenomenology is to ask the question how it is to live this or that, how it is, how does it feel. And this is your experience as a scientist and a therapist, that this is teaching you something, and you should listen to it. And not just only watch the data and statistics. Because the statistics, they're all right, but they're just one angle of the thing, and the whole thing is maybe hidden behind. And then I think it's very important this is one of the quotes I really like a lot from Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Si ma conscience a un corps, pourquoi les autres corps n'auraient-ils pas de conscience? My experience is evident, and I have the impression that I have a body, so why should the other bodies I perceive around me should not have consciousness? And this also means that we should ask how we treat animals. For me, this is a very important conclusion from this phenomenological view on consciousness, that we have to accept the idea that there are also consciousness in other beings around us. And then this is the real question we should be interested as scientists and as psychotherapists, how it is to lose a loved one, how it is to feel betrayed in a relationship, or to be tortured, or to be soldier in Ukraine, how it is. Or how it is to live ecstasis, to dance, or to paint, how it is. And then, almost at the end, is just to be aware that the more we know, we should be aware that the knowledge that we do not know is also increasing. So this is the round of knowledge which is always increasing, it's no doubt about it, but we should be aware that there's the border between knowing and not knowing that is increasing much more than the knowledge. And I really miss this point in modern science, that there's acknowledgement of all the things we do not know. We pretend to know so much. And this is just to remind the main problems of science we have no clue about. It's gravity, it's a chicken-egg problem, it's a mind-body problem. We do not know how in our brain or body is created the mind. We do not know it. Although we have so many data on brain scans, we do not know it. And this is called the brain consciousness gap. And this is just, for me, important that psychedelic science should bring up all this questioning. And I just sometimes see they're just bringing up the old questions with the old methods, and this is not bringing us anywhere. And this is why I really emphasize for therapists that they should do all self-experience with these substances. And of course, at the moment, this is not legal. The only thing we can do is holotropic breathwork. I think this is very crucial to emphasize that this is a possibility. And there are people here in the area doing this very well. So I recommend to people who do not want to take a substance to make a holotropic breathwork weekend. And this is very deep. And you don't need to take a substance for that. And what I do in Lausanne with a colleague is I train colleagues with ketamine. And I tell them, use it and do it. It's okay, and do it with your patients as well, before even considering doing MDMA. And last, I was much intrigued, as I said already, by the COVID crisis, and now the crisis even getting deeper with the Ukraine war. And I think we have a deep problem of a collective dissociation. And that's why I wrote that book during the COVID crisis, and I'm very pleased that it's open now. And I think we have, and this is what I try to prove with Google Ngrams, that we have an epidemic of interest of the figure of vampires, werewolves, and zombies. And if you try to read that in the psychopathology of patients or the people in general, I think this is quite true. And these are all figures of traumatic archetypes which can be found in our society. So I have wrote a book about this, and this is kind of what I wish to develop, understanding and awareness about this phenomenon. Thank you.